Firing line with William F. Buckley, Jr.
Robert Scheer has emerged since the liquidation of founder-publisher Edward Keating as the principal figure in Ramparts magazine, well known principally for blowing the CIA, though known even before that to students of anti-American and radical agitation. Anti-American is, of course, my word, and in due course we'll be discussing precisely that, the nature of anti-Americanism. But meanwhile, Mr. Scheer is by training not an agitator, but an economist who studied at CCNY in New York and subsequently at Syracuse. He went on to Berkeley, where he took a job as a teaching assistant, but soon transferred his interest to Southeast Asia, which he has several times visited in his passion to find the United States responsible for all that goes wrong there. Mr. Scheer has also resented our role in Cuba and is co-author of, quotes, Cuba, Tragedy in Our Hemisphere. In 1966, Mr. Scheer ran as the peace candidate in the Democratic primary in the Berkeley area and took 45% of the vote away from a hard and fast liberal opponent, the congressional incumbent. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Scheer whether he believes it is possible to use the word anti-American about anybody on the American left, and if so, who?
We'll be back with Mr. Scheer's answer in just a moment.
I've really been. My name is C. Dickerman Williams, and I shall act as chairman of this discussion between Mr. Buckley and Mr. Scheer. The subject is Ramparts anti-American? Mr. Scheer, will you answer Mr. Buckley's question?
Well, before I answer his question, let me just state that I didn't find that Mr. Buckley's very fine reading of the cue card served as a fair introduction, any more than had I been introducing Mr. Buckley and said that he is well known as a person who has visited Africa and in his efforts to show how poorly the Africans are controlling their affairs and how successfully the white colonialists in Rhodesia, South Africa, and Angola are doing so, and in his attempts to further besmirch the American image by identifying it with racism, he has supported various other regimes throughout the world which have attempted to prevent people from controlling their own lives. There are obviously other things that have to be said about Mr. Buckley, but just
I think I see why you don't have your own
show. Yes, but as long as you have your own show, don't pretend to be a moderator and a participant at the same time. And
I'm not a
prosecutor. Let me just get on to the question. First of all, about the introduction, it's not true that I am the spokesman for Ramparts. Unlike the National Review, we do have an editorial board that votes on matters and makes its decisions collectively. I don't take responsibility for every article that's in Ramparts. There are 3 other editors that participate with me in an editorial board, and if you check the masthead, you can see their names. As to the...
Are you looking for an opportunity to disavow some of the stuff that's been published?
No, it's not that. It's just that it is not one-man journalism. It's not my private organ, and we participate, as I said, in editorial board meetings, and at times I'm outvoted. So it is not a reflection of my own political views or my own literary standards so much as that of the 4 of us. And if you'll check the masthead, you'll see that my name is not even the most prominently as far as its ordering. As to your question about anti-Americanism, I don't find the category of anti-American terribly useful, although you seem to. My own feeling is you first have to ask, how do you conceive of him as American? What are its interests? And how do you go about determining what is American, what is interest? To my knowledge, there really isn't a serious group on the left that feels it's anti-American. Certainly, I have difference of opinion with various groups on the left as to what the best interests of this country are and what should be done in this country. That's why there are different groups. But if you ask the very simple question of whether people on the left would describe themselves as anti-American, I don't know of a serious group. That
No,
is, say one
I
has
didn't
more
ask
than
that.
5 or 10 members.
No, I didn't ask that, because that was not what I intended to ask. What I intended to ask was whether you, in spite of your diminished importance, consider that
Participation
there is
in
such a
democracy
thing.
is not diminishing one's importance. You know?
All right,
It's
yes.
to force the ideas.
Subspecia tenetatis, you are important. But what I want to know is, do you consider anybody anti-American on the American left? And if so, who?
No, if you raise the
Not
question
that
of
they
do we
consider
disagree
themselves,
about what policy should be pursued by this government, we certainly have disagreements. I do with people on the right.
No, I didn't
But
ask that.
I don't think, I wouldn't define any group in the American political
so
spectrum
that's your
as being anti-American, because I don't find the term to be an accurate or precise one.
So therefore,
That goes for the right as well as the left.
therefore you deny the meaning of that term. You refuse
I
to
find it a
believe
very
that anybody's
sloppy
had
term. If you want to define the term, I'll apply it.
Well, suppose I say I hate America. Would you then call me anti-American?
That broader statement I would accept.
You would?
Yes. If you really meant it that way, and this was the statement of your political
Suppose I ask you
program.
to take my word for it.
No, but if you didn't embellish upon it at all, and you didn't have any other points, and it wasn't a rhetorical point, fine. You know.
But only under those
In other words,
sort
if
of
you said the total
circumstances.
statement of my position is that I hate America, then I think you could quite accurately be described as being anti-American.
Yeah. Well, would you say, for instance, that someone was anti-American who was pledged, let's say, to pledged to remove the United States Constitution by force and violence if necessary? Would that make him anti-American or not?
Well, it depends again how you define the term. I assume you think there's something wrong about being anti-American.
Oh, I do, yes, because I'm
So why don't you
pro-American,
just put
yeah.
the question in terms of would I condemn someone or do I disagree with the position taken by that
because
person?
that's interesting.
If you're trying to ask should that point of view be tolerated, then why don't you put the question that way? But it seems to me
Well,
by
you see,
sort of hiding behind anti-Americanism or the concept, you're confusing the discussion.
You see, because you were invited on this program to discuss the question
But
whether
this is the first I've heard
Ramparts
about
was
it.
anti-American.
No, I've never heard about it before.
Well,
this
you
moment.
should have asked the other 3 editors to inform you about your...
I think since you are more
Why don't you
actively
try to
involved,
ad-lib then, since that was the topic of the question? Is Ramparts anti-American?
I don't find it a very useful title. If you want to stick to it, then I think you best define the term.
Yes, well, that's what I'm trying to do. But in order to define it, I have to first of all begin by asking whether it means anything to you. Now, I'm aware...
I find it a rhetorical slogan that's used by people who usually want to silence other opinions and so forth.
Yes, that's what I expected you would say. And which is one of the reasons why I thought it important for you to ratify what I thought you would say. But I have found that the whole concept of anti-Americanism seems to be increasingly elusive. And I ask myself why. It's possible to use terms like anti-Semitic, it's possible to use terms like anti-Christian, like anti-Negro, anti-white, anti-colonial, but all of a sudden it doesn't seem to be possible to use anti-American, and I tend to believe that the reason it is increasingly impossible is because some people don't want to face up to the logical meaning of the positions that they take. Now, for instance, you recently
if you want to clarify that, I'm quite willing to get into that. If you say someone's anti-Negro, anti-Jewish, I assume that you're making a relatively simple comment that
that
Jewishness can rather precisely be defined in terms of either religious belief or parentage, and that a person, ipso facto, then would be against a person who had that religious belief or parentage. My only problem with anti-Americanism is that I don't suspect that your concept of what the core of being an American and mine would be the same. If you could come up with such a very simple and clear definition of what an American is, then I'm willing to talk about anti-Americanism. If you want, for purposes of rhetoric, I'm perfectly willing to use the term. I find your support of the government of South Africa and Rhodesia and the Dominican Republic and the Diem regime to be anti-American, but I'm also willing to concede that we can have a serious disagreement about what Americanism is.
Correct. I note and remark your digression and return, if you don't mind, to the subject under discussion.
Well, why is that a digression? I don't see it as a digression.
Well,
unless you're willing to define the term anti-American, we're going to sit here for an hour piddling around this point.
Because I'm not talking about South Africa, I'm talking about America.
No, but if you're not willing to define what you mean by that term, then it doesn't seem to me you should use it. Why wait until 20 minutes from now to define it?
I'm quite willing to define it, but I'm rather enjoying your embarrassment.
I don't feel the least bit embarrassed. I would rather talk about your substantive issues.
You recently...
by the way, if you want to get into that kind of thing, I don't feel merely having a certain kind of grin or look to your eyes is the opposite of being embarrassed. If you do want to engage in this kind of thing, we could spend the rest of the time on it. But I would rather hear your description of what the core of Americanism is, your own position, and then we could discuss the issues involved.
If I may, in this democracy that you began by hailing, I'll move into it in my own way. A while ago, you wrote an essay on Bertrand Russell, and in that essay, you quoted a critic of Mr. Russell, an English intellectual, so you described him, writing in the New York Times Sunday magazine, Mr. Bernard Levin, who wrote in the New York Times Sunday magazine that Lord Russell, quotes, has turned into a full-time purveyor of political garbage, indistinguishable from the routine products of the Soviet machine, as a result of his, quotes, rancorous hatred of the U.S. Now, this would presumably make him at least anti-American, would it not? But nowhere in the balance of that article did you object to the terminology, which all of a sudden you're objecting to here tonight. You didn't say, what in the hell does Mr. Levin mean by having a rancorous hatred of the U.S.? You simply accepted it as a perfectly negotiable, polemical
No, I talked about the specific points of Levin's article, which is, for one thing, if you want to take this argument that he advanced that Bertrand Russell is an apologist, a simple propagandist for the Soviet machine, I tried to argue that that's not the case, that in a situation, for instance, of the Russian intervention in Hungary, he certainly was in opposition. Most recently, he was opposed to the Russian position on the Middle East, in fact, appealed to people to criticize the Soviet position in support of the Arab countries, and I tried to argue that, in that sense, he was not a propagandist, that Russell was being rather consistent in terms of his own position, and I tried to explain the reasons for his arriving at that position.
Right. And the concluding sentence in that essay was, quote, if in his last years Russell is anti-American and must now judge our president as a murderer, then it is not his actions that ought to be scrutinized, but our own. By which, if I can read English, and yours is sometimes inscrutable, you seem to be saying...
It's very clever.
You seem to be saying that Lord Russell, that we ought to look to ourselves for having caused Bertrand Russell to be anti-American, rather than to look to Bertrand Russell and ask why all of a sudden he would become...
No, what I took was Levine's argument and that of others, which said that Russell was systematically anti-American, which was the phrase they used. The argument being that he was not interested in the facts, that his position had absolutely nothing to do with the factual situation of the world, and that he simply had an axe to grind against the United States per se. I tried to argue that Russell's position and the shift in his position from his early very strong anti-communism to his current position of criticism of the American government was based on a shift in the world reality, and that America's policy in Cuba and Vietnam and elsewhere was different in Russell's eyes than it had been in the early 50s and in the late 40s. And that accounted for a change of position, so that when I said one ought to look...
justified, right?
What I said in addition to that is that one ought to look not to some ingrained psychological need on the part of Russell to attack the United States, but rather to American foreign policy and why it would cause Russell to unleash this new criticism. So in that sense, if one wants to identify anti-Americanism with any systematic critique of American foreign policy, and Americanism with a belief in whatever the State Department and the current president believes in at that moment, then I would have to find not only Bertrand Russell, but you systematically anti-American, because you've never had a president yet that you've been able to prove. Right.
Absolutely. However, it is true that I bear my disappointments less rancorously than you do your own.
Why is that?
And without calling for instance, civil disobedience. And
It's
in any
just not
case,
your
my
style,
differences tend to be tactical, you know, rather than
What does
something.
that
Well, for
mean?
instance,
By the way, you know, it's I don't see where civil disobedience is a much more serious break with the society than the type of break espoused by groups that you've been associated with.
Well, I think that would be an interesting point
We can have
to
another
pursue
program on this.
in due course, yeah. But now, did you suppress in that particular article any major disagreement that you in fact have with Bertrand Russell? Here is an article in which you quote somebody as saying that he was rancorously anti-American, and you end the article by saying, well, if he's anti-American, we oughtn't to look to wonder whether or not his whole intellectual and moral equipment is deteriorating, but whether or not the United States is objectively provoking people.
I didn't say one shouldn't look at whether his intellectual equipment is deteriorating. I looked at it. That's why I went to interview him. That's why I did the story.
Yeah.
And I, in fact, quoted Levine as in another part of his article saying that he hadn't thought there was any deterioration at all to Russell's functioning. And I don't think there's been another serious critic who's really suggested that, and certainly not in the New York Times. The point I made is that one is going to have to do more than simply assert that Russell has had a breakdown, or that he's senile. And,
but you're suggesting that America has become pretty unlovely during the 60s, right?
Right, and as to the question of whether I have any disagreements with Russell, I did point out that I found his position on various questions to be somewhat muddled, and not because he's senile, but because many people are muddled on various questions, unless they're dogmatists. And I particularly felt that his attitude towards Marxism was rather improperly defined. So forth. There's a lot of that in the article.
Yeah.
It's a long article.
But you seem to be extremely reluctant.
Gentlemen, may we continue our discussion in just a moment after this brief interruption.
Mr. Scheer, you seem to be extremely reluctant to accept what I consider to be the intellectual requirements of your own analysis, namely that, sure, Bertrand Russell's anti-American, but he has a damn good right to be anti-American because during the 1960s we became a highly unlovely country, and anybody, in fact, who is pro-American at this point in time has an addled wit, to say nothing of an unserviceable moral sense. Now,
well, can I just
why do you have this reluctance? Why don't you say, yes, I am anti-American?
Because you haven't defined the term, and the reason I used the term is it was not a term of my choosing. It was rather Russell's critics accused him of being systematically anti-American.
But you didn't jump into using that term.
Not providing any definition of that. Now, for instance, in the case of Levine, he's a pro-American in Vietnam position. He's espoused that. He's signed petitions and so forth. But in his article, he tried to indicate that that had nothing to do at all with his feeling that Russell was systematically anti-American. Since the critics of Russell have not been willing to define what they mean by the term, I simply said in that conclusion that those who feel that Russell has somehow descended into a kind of irrational anti-Americanism, whatever that may mean, ought best to look at what has been happening in the world and what are the policies that Russell is criticizing. Now, Russell criticizes very strongly on the case of Cuba. I gather in the choice between Castro and Batista, you personally supported Batista and certainly support what are called the right-wing counter-revolutionaries by those who support Castro. In a choice between Castro and Batista, I would support Castro. In a choice between Diem and Ho Chi Minh, I support Ho Chi Minh probably as reluctantly as you support Diem. They're imperfect choices. But the fact is that people make these choices. And I think Russell has made these choices, and I think it's unfair to characterize his having come to that particular conclusion with this sort of slogan or term of anti-Americanism unless you're willing to define it. Now, in my conversations with Russell, he certainly didn't feel hostile to the American people. He certainly saw much in what might be called the Western liberal tradition to admire. He is a very strong critic of Soviet communism. He certainly doesn't think it has much to show an advanced nation in the way of new institutions and so forth. And I didn't find him to be hysterical on these points at all. Now, if you want to give the term anti-American some more precise definition, I think we can get on with that discussion.
Well, if you say that you heard him express no dislike for the American people, but certainly he must feel a considerable condescension for them. He says, for instance, I think Lyndon Johnson is just an ordinary murderer. Well, in the first place, nobody could call Mr. Johnson an ordinary murderer. If anything, he's an extraordinary murderer, but certainly not an ordinary murderer.
I'm sure Russell would accept that.
Yeah, and when you consider, but you told me he was still very logical, but when you consider that the overwhelming majority of the American people support
it's not so
that
overwhelming.
conduct
To the
of
last
well,
poll,
60 or 70%.
Well, the last poll around 43% support the president, which I gather is the
No,
lowest.
no. I'm talking about
45.
supporting those, presumably. Presumably, Lord Russell is not sore at LBJ for integrating the schools or whatever, and yet Johnson loses much more support for doing that than for bombing North Vietnam, and you know it. As regards the North Vietnam policy, 60 or 70% of the American people are behind LBJ. Now, how can Lord Russell, feeling as he does, that the overwhelming majority of a particular people are very enthusiastic about a, quote, ordinary murderer, feel anything less than contempt for those people?
Well, I gather that you felt you certainly dissociate yourself from the overwhelming majority of Americans who supported Eisenhower. I believe you described him at one point as a boob who could barely articulate a phrase, and yet you certainly didn't feel contempt for the American people. They had been just momentarily misled, right? The majority makes incorrect...
I felt considering the alternatives, the American people made a brilliant choice.
Well, that wasn't the substance of your article at that time. You certainly didn't feel that way as regards the Kennedy administration and the election of Johnson. You've never, it seems to me, on my mind, in the post-war period, been in agreement with the majority of Americans, and you've been rather contemptuous of the conclusions which they've arrived at. Yet I don't think you would...
No, but I would be
fair,
very, I would be
think it's
very
fair for me
contemptuous.
to judge you as being contemptuous of the people as such, and I think Russell finds himself in disagreement with the
You're making some
opinion of the
childish
majority
analogies
of
by this.
Americans.
I would be very uncomfortable with the majority of the American people if they elected as president somebody I considered an ordinary murderer. Now, it's one thing. It's one thing, or even an extraordinary murderer. It's one thing to be impatient with the American people for electing as president somebody different from somebody whom oneself would prefer, like, say, Robert Taft. But it is something else to continue to esteem a people who would elect an ordinary murderer. Now, this is the kind of thing that, for instance, was done in Germany when Hitler was voted into office, and I think that most of us agree that any German who held the voting population of Germany in high regard in 1933 was himself pretty myopic, and that severe forms of protest were in order. But how are you defending A, Russell, and B, yourself, and C, Ramparts magazine,
That's a very strange...
when you are constantly moving in the direction of criticizing the United States and actually hoping for a destruction, not merely of its foreign policy, as it might be, as Democrat and Republican might disagree about it, but actually its fundamental commitments. For instance, that an evolutionary democracy in South Vietnam is preferable to something that goes on in under Ho Chi Minh in the north, or in Cuba.
Well, that's not our position, and it certainly isn't Bertrand Russell's, and it's neither mine nor the magazine. Our position is, as far as Vietnam, that effectively the West ruled out the alternatives, first in attempting to reassert the French colonial rule over Vietnam, in wiping out any opposition other than the Viet Minh and leaving the Viet Minh as the only alternative to the French colonialists, then in the selection and installation of Diem in power in Vietnam and the underwriting of the cost of that regime by the United States.
Yeah,
and
you
the
just
fact
said
that,
you would prefer Ho to Diem,
continue on
not.
this, in the process, particularly in the years 55, 56, when the Diem regime systematically eliminated any of the opposition that was still around in Saigon that wasn't communist, be it in the religious sects, or be it the Trotskyists, or be it the Social Democrats and so forth. My feeling is that any talk of a third way has effectively been ruled out by the United States, and we've created a situation in which the communists are in effect the only party that is in opposition to colonialism. Now, if one wants to go back 20 years and talk about what could have been possible in Vietnam, we could have a very interesting discussion. I think the same thing is true in Cuba, where for various historical reasons, Batista and Castro were left as the two choices, and given that choice, I would prefer Castro to Batista. But let me add, by the way, that I don't think that my choice in the matter is terribly important. One of the principles I'm interested in, and which you disparage continuously, is that of self-determination. And I'd like to see the Vietnamese, if they are so dissatisfied with Ho Chi Minh or with the National Liberation Front, indicate it by fighting against it. And basically, my argument is not whether they should have one regime or another, but I can't understand why they have consistently refused to fight for those regimes which we've offered them.
Don't you see, Mr.
And never
Scheer,
at all had the same reluctance in
yeah.
fighting for the other side.
But you see, the trouble with resisting Ho Chi Minh is that you get shot if you do. And that a lot of people
Despite
aren't
what,
prepared to do. I mean, maybe you wouldn't even publish Ramparts if you got
despite
shot.
what Mr. Luce said
in
about the
consequence
Diem
of it.
regime in your magazine, one got shot in South Vietnam for very similar offense, and certainly from the first days of
Well,
that
I don't
regime.
deny.
I might point out, by the way, that this doesn't seem to trouble you
No, I
at
don't
all
deny
about
that they're
the
at war.
South African or Rhodesian regimes, which certainly throw dissenters in jail, and yet you
love
have argued...
Rhodesia, don't you?
Well, you do. You
All
put it on the cover of
conversational
your
roads,
magazine, didn't you?
Yes, I...
Didn't you call the leader of Rhodesia,
you
what
put
is it,
the
helping
United
to bring
States on
down
the cover of your
Rhodesia's
magazine doesn't mean you
George
run that over
Washington, and you went overboard, right?
No, I
And
didn't go to Rhodesia.
You
no.
called Ian Smith in your magazine the George Washington figure of Africa,
I
right?
did not. I say that he's considered that, and as a matter of fact...
How the U.S. is helping to bring down Rhodesia's George Washington.
And as
That's
a
a
matter
pretty
of fact,
blanket endorsement for a man who has 200,000 whites running a state in which you have 4 million
Correct.
blacks who have no effective control or power or civil liberties or anything else.
And that's right.
I
Yeah.
might
Wait a minute. Don't go on and on and on. Lyndon Johnson...
Well, I can't help it. You've gone on and on in the support of racist
Lyndon
governments,
Johnson
you know.
called Diem the George Washington of South Vietnam 2 years before receiving the endorsement of the Americans for Democratic Action for President of the United
Americans
States.
for Democratic Action and
I
National
know.
Review share that.
They're much too
onus,
pro-American for your
obviously,
taste,
right.
I know. Now,
but why don't you ever
let's-
want to raise the question of South Africa or Rhodesia? Because I think that bears on the point.
Well,
Obviously, in
I've
the
written
world,
I have written
one is going to have
extensively
Mr.
imperfect
Scheer,
choices.
perhaps
you
Mr.
say.
Buckley could have a minute or two.
Yeah. Why don't, Mr. Chairman, let's dispose of Rhodesia and South Africa, because Mr. Scheer has this salacious interest in my position on them.
Well, your
My
magazine
position
did.
on South Africa and Rhodesia and Haiti and Saudi Arabia and Morocco and you name
Stick
it
to one at a
is
time.
precisely the same as Senator Fulbright's, that irrespective of how obnoxious I consider the doctrines that govern those countries so long as they do not become a part of international movement designed to deprive me of my freedom, I don't consider it a part of American foreign policy to go and interfere.
So then the question of how one
See,
judges
period,
the
end. Now,
internal policies of a regime are irrelevant to consideration of foreign policy.
right,
So
and
the question of whether Ho Chi Minh is a dictator or a Democrat is really irrelevant. What we have to decide is whether he threatens America's interest.
That's correct.
Right.
And I'm...
So it's unfair to bring up the question.
Perhaps we let Mr. Buckley finish.
Sure, no, but
totalitarianism.
let me just say that I'm convinced, and otherwise I would very much oppose our action there, that they do threaten American interests.
Right.
That is to say, I'm satisfied that Mr. Kennedy and before that Mr. Eisenhower and after that Mr. Johnson aren't flat out of their mind, nor are there strategists who tell them that the loss of South Vietnam would mean very dire consequences in the whole area of the world, a judgment in which, incidentally, as you know, the chiefs of state of the contiguous countries, with a single exception, uniformly agree. But one of the reasons why I find it difficult to think of Ramparts and your own position as other than anti-American is that it seems to me that your whole rhetoric suggests that nothing would make you more pleased than to see United States foreign policy simply collapse in those areas. I think, frankly, that nothing would disappoint you more than if tomorrow we won the war in Vietnam and the day after there was a free revolt against Ho Chi Minh, and the day after that there was a plebiscitary democracy in which all your old friends were run out of town. I think that would really disappoint you dreadfully, and I think one of the reasons why it would disappoint you is because you can't stand the thought of America having been right on this.
Gentlemen, may we pursue these points further in just a moment?
Go ahead, Mr. Scheer.
Yes, first of all, Mr. Buckley promised to handle the question of Africa, but didn't, and I would like to say one word about that. Your position on Africa is a matter of record and should be stated here. You said, and I quote, "The people who picked apartheid are solidly committed to it. It is a radical solution in which they are investing their wit, their passion, and their means. They are men and women of urbanity and culture and understanding and of courage who are not fooling themselves or trying to fool the world." You also said, "I know it is a sincere people's effort to fashion the land of peace they want so badly." I'm not going to go through a whole list of atrocities in South Africa, but I think if that is much worse kind of apologetics than the left has engaged in relation to any tyranny of the left.
Tell me why.
Because it's very easy to say that people who are suppressing other people are doing so out of a sincere desire to help them. I'm sure a similar argument could be advanced for Khrushchev in Hungary or any other regime, but the fact of the matter is if the people who are being suppressed don't feel that way, and then one is forced to gun them down as one was forced to in South Africa.
You can say that about the president of Macy's and President of Gimbel's.
I promised uninterrupted time at this point.
But we do try to avoid monologues, but let's give Mr. Scheer some more time.
Your position on Angola and on Rhodesia is also a matter of record, but let me answer the question which you raised about whether Ramparts or I am systematically anti-American. We have defended America's position in various instances. I might add that at an earlier period I was very severely critical, and so was the magazine, of the Soviet position. We have constantly referred to the incorrectness and viciousness of the Soviet administration of Eastern Europe following the Second World War. We have drawn an analogy, and I did in that Russell article, as did Russell himself, between the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and the Soviet involvement in Hungary. And so I don't feel that I don't feel that the question of inconsistency can be raised in quite that context. What I would like to argue is not for the United States losing so much, you put it in these simple win-or-loser terms, but pursuing a very different foreign policy. I think we're beginning to see that in the United States. I think Galbraith has called for this, Fulbright has, and so forth, where we come to recognize that the very simplistic theory of the international communist theory, conspiracy, which is the basis of your whole posture, that a communist government anywhere in the world is an extension of this international power which has to be contained because it threatens American interests, is a theory way out of date in a day when you have the Sino-Soviet dispute and you've had the obvious breakup of such a movement. I might point out that current U.S. policy is one of supporting certain communist governments which you oppose. For example, our aid to Poland, our aid to Yugoslavia. You feel at times that is near treason.
Mr. Scheer, we do like to change back and forth, and I think perhaps just for the sake of interruption, let Mr. Buckley have some time now, and then if Mr. Buckley takes too much time, we'll go back to you.
In the course of investigating the CIA, I'm surprised you didn't run into this. We are supposed to be supporting the Polish government, as you put it, because the thesis is that by aiding the Polish government, we will aid those forces in Poland which are actively engaged in mitigating the harshness of that government. It is not because we are in favor of that government. So please don't delude yourself.
Aid to Poland and Yugoslavia, right?
Yes, I am.
Because you feel that aids the international communist movement and you accept
that
model.
I don't think that it is working.
Right. But I think it's unfair of you to say that I'm the only one that is interested in challenging that model when in fact the State Department itself, in the case of Poland and Yugoslavia, has challenged that model. The State Department does not feel that communist Yugoslavia and communist Poland pose a threat to America's interest. You're arguing that any communist state anywhere in the world automatically poses a threat to America's interest. So in that sense, you're in the maverick position, and my position is tending to become the dominant one in the United States.
No. Let me make the distinction for you, and forever after, you will have an easier time coping with it. The distinction is that the American government makes two policies. One concerning those governments that have already been occupied by the communists and over which the communists have de facto control. And that policy is one of trying to build bridges. They have a completely different policy towards governments that the communists are trying to capture but haven't yet captured, you follow. So that, for instance, we oppose them in South Korea, we oppose them in South Vietnam, we oppose them in West Berlin, we oppose them in Quemoy and Matsu, even by firing guns if necessary for that purpose. But the moment they occupied West Berlin or Quemoy or Matsu, or for that matter South Vietnam, you're quite right. Pretty soon we'd be trying to build bridges, presumably with your enthusiastic
let me ask you a factual question on that. Are you arguing then that communist Poland, as it's now constituted, represents a threat to America's interest and an extension of international communist power?
Well, I think it's awfully obvious that they do. After all, wars are fought with people, and
what does that mean? That Gomulka would sell out Polish interests to the Soviet Union, for instance?
Well, already has.
Well, how come in the National Review, in an article by Alice Leon Moats in December 1956, it was written about Gomulka, that although he is a fanatical communist, he is also a patriotic Pole who will never sell out his country to a foreign power.
Which you proved, obviously.
This combination has produced a regime that, though communist, is not communist in the Russian way.
I'm glad you had the grace to give the date, which was 2 weeks after Gomulka.
I'm sorry, no, the date is May 23rd, 1959. I caught you off base on that by mistake.
Oh, well, it's quite true that over a period of several years, Gomulka seemed to be challenging Khrushchev. As you may or may not remember, he even kept Khrushchev from landing in Warsaw there for a critical 2 hours, committing a sovereign act of lèse-majesté.
But as I say, this is May 23rd, 1959, yeah, which is long after any consolidation of the Soviet presence. And certainly,
it was 2 years after that. 2 years after that,
influence in Poland is much less now than it was in 1959.
It was 2 years after that Gomulka closed down
Who is this Alice
Post
Leon Moats, by the way? Is she a regular staffer, a trusted correspondent?
I don't think you want me to answer these questions.
No, I'm quite serious.
Well, why do we go on
towards
Alice Leon Moats?
I find that position to be most refreshing in the National Review, a great variance with your official position.
I know it will embarrass you enormously for me to answer one of the questions that you raised. And if you like, I will allow you to withdraw your questions immediately after asking them. Would that make it more interesting?
It's a convenient way, and you obviously have a clap
what he said.
What I am curious about is how this article about Poland could be such great variance with the very simplistic theory which dominates the National Review, which is that any communist society in the world is a threat to America's interests and an extension of either Soviet or Chinese power. And this was a reporter for your magazine who went to Poland and concluded quite the opposite.
Well, first of all, let me say something that you will find extremely simplistic, and that is that I think that the United States has a stake in freedom throughout the world. And therefore, to the extent that anybody's freedom is diminished, for instance, the freedom of your ex-friends, the Cubans, then to that extent American foreign policy suffers. But it also follows that to the extent that the Soviet Union increases its sovereignty over other nations, then it also increases its potential threat. If the Soviet Union were withdrawn to withdraw to Greater Moscow, obviously it wouldn't constitute a very great threat. Does that strike you as simplistic?
Let me ask you a question about that. If it turned out, just in a problematical situation, that the people wanted to go communist, had some experience with it and so forth, would you feel that that society would be a threat to America's interest?
Well, absolutely.
And so you would be for American intervention to overthrow that regime?
Certainly.
So your position,
suppose I sincerely want to murder you. Do you have any right to object?
Let me ask you a question about that, because certainly the people in that particular society
How do you know?
would not define their... I mean, the communist Yugoslavia, for example, do not currently, as far as I know, have never really stated their desire to murder Americans, and don't seem to pose a very real danger to America's security, and certainly not to your personal freedom. If that's the case, and assuming, as say Bob Considine did in 1964, that a majority of Cubans did support Castro, or assuming that the 4 million people in Rhodesia don't support the 200,000 white people that you happen to support and would like to have a slightly different government, perhaps even a communistic government, you're asserting then the United States should intervene anywhere in the world where a communist regime or a regime that's Marxist-Leninist threatens to come to power no matter what support for it.
For so long as it's communist in the sense in which I understand the word.
Well, how is that?
If it's communist in the Ramparts sense, then
what does that mean? What do you mean communist in Ramparts?
I say communist in the Ramparts.
In the sense we use the term?
Yeah.
One of the things we've said is,
is that
we don't think the term has any accurate meaning.
Mr. Buckley,
That's a slander. What do you mean? I say it's fascist in the National Review.
He's going to tell you what he means.
I'll tell you exactly what I mean. I'll tell you exactly what I mean. If it's communist in the sense that Ramparts uses the word i.e., that it has lost all of its meaning, Mr. George Kennan uses it the same way, then of course it becomes a matter of trifling interest to me in what direction a particular nation goes. I would still hope that people would go against any nation that seeks to become communist, for so long as communism means at least this, that the minority gets no right any more than it has a right in Poland or in Yugoslavia or what are your other favorite country, Cuba, to protest the domination.
That's part of the condition? That's a condition? You don't accept that condition in Rhodesia or South Africa?
No, what I accept about Rhodesia and South Africa is that communism is not involved
You
under
raised
even
the
your
question.
definition.
You raised an internal ingredient. You said, you know, if it's not a threat, and secondly, if it allows the minority to dissent. But you don't feel that way about South Africa, Rhodesia, Angola, Cuba before Castro or any other government.
For the reasons I tried to make clear half an hour ago, which apparently you did not comprehend, namely...
Is it possible that we just disagree and it's not a question of comprehension?
No, because I think that this is becoming now a characteristic which
the inability of
illuminates
people
your
to, people agree with you is an
processes.
inability to understand you.
Well, I think this is largely the difficulty.
I think
Yes.
it's a very dangerous trap to
For instance, a moment ago I said here that I was not going to defend the government of Haiti, for instance, which is more severe than many governments, even in some governments that are titularly communist, or the government of Saudi Arabia. But I'm not prepared to land the Marines in either place because I don't see it as a part of a concerted endeavor to eliminate the freedom of other people. Haiti hasn't even marched against the Dominican Republic, or as a matter of fact, vice versa. So you do understand that.
And Yugoslavia hasn't marched either, neither has Poland.
No, well,
if they march against anybody, it'd probably be against East Germany.
Yugoslavia found it necessary to kill an awful lot of people.
Now you're raising an internal
That's right.
Because you certainly wouldn't raise that in relation to South Africa or Rhodesia, right?
Now, wait a minute. And Yugoslavia has said, for instance, that it stands ready to help the forces of democracy in Vietnam, by which it means the forces that you consider the forces of democracy. And it is even now exporting goods.
Well, why do you say that, by the way? That's inaccurate. And incidentally, on that point, I'm a little tired of the inaccurate definition of my position. I've never said that that's the force of democracy.
Well,
I have said that's the forces of self-determination. But I am interested in a question of fact. That you referred to the Cubans as first my friends and then my ex-friends. I guess in the last 10 minutes they've changed. In your magazine recently, you had an article on Ramparts, if I can ask a factual question, in which you characterized me as a person who had visited Cuba in defiance of State Department regulations and made a secret trip to Prague only this February on the eve of the NSA expose. What is the basis for that statement, that sentence, with two factual points?
I don't know. Am I supposed to challenge anything?
It's an editorial in the National Review about me personally. Yeah. If I had written an editorial in Ramparts magazine, or if we had an editorial in Ramparts magazine saying that you had done two things, one of which was illegal.
Don't be fancy about it. Do you deny it?
Certainly.
Oh, you do deny it?
Absolutely.
Why didn't you write us and tell us?
I beg your pardon?
Why didn't you write us and tell us?
It's a very recent issue of the National Review, and I knew I would have this wonderful opportunity. We were supposed to tape this a month ago, and I thought I'd have this opportunity to raise it with you in person. But that's not the point. The thing is that here is a statement which says that I visited Cuba in defiance of State Department regulations, which is in fact committed an illegal act, when in fact I went to Cuba at a time when it was perfectly legal to go and had no problem getting permission. You say I made a secret trip to Prague, and you hint mysteriously on the eve of the NSA expose, when in fact my trip to Prague was announced in the Berkeley Gazette, the San Francisco Chronicle. I spoke publicly about it before and after, and there was absolutely nothing secret about it. And what's more, I checked with the American Embassy in various countries about travel regulation.
It was so
Wait a
minute.
What does it mean that it's secret?
It was so characterized by Mr. Carl Rowan, former head of U.S. Information Agency.
Inaccurately.
And well, all right, but why didn't you get the word around about all these inaccuracies?
Well, I told Mr. Rusher, by the way, in a program in Palo Alto, your publisher, that this was an inaccuracy, and he promised there would be a statement in the magazine correcting it. I haven't seen it yet, but I presume it's going to come soon.
Well, it'll certainly come at your prompting.
But I'm curious about this kind of...
No, as a matter of fact,
when Mr. Sherry was
it always surprised me that you would do anything that secret.
You were terribly upset about any factual errors in his book. I think it was called Extremism of the Right. I remember you taking him over the coals for it, and you quoted this page and that page, and you asked him, what is sources? And he said, well, I don't know. There were just some other people put out the book and so forth. And you said, isn't that irresponsible to have these facts and not have the source? And here in your magazine, you slander my position and certainly my own personal activities. You feel it's a very mild-mannered thing. It doesn't, you know, when you slander Goldwater or the National Review,
wait a minute.
It's very serious business.
Presumably quoting somebody who was ratified by the United States Senate as equipped to handle United States Information Agency is not quoting somebody who is putatively irresponsible, is it?
Gentlemen, may we interrupt very briefly and then come back to our points under discussion?
Mr. Buckley, do you recognize the right of a patriotic American to disagree with his government on foreign policy?
Obviously.
How would you distinguish between such disagreement and anti-Americanism?
Well, I think somebody has a right to be anti-American also. I don't deny that Ramparts has a right to be anti-American, but I also think that it is worthwhile to examine what in fact it is. If it's in disagreement over methods of achieving the same ends that are generally desired, that's one thing. If it's actually seeking a sort of a revolutionary change in the whole American system, I think that's something else.
Mr. Scheer, do you recognize that there's such a thing as treason?
Yeah, in any society. Sometimes justified and sometimes not.
How would you distinguish between treason and anti-Americanism?
I've never gotten a definition of this anti-Americanism as Mr. Buckley uses it, so I'd rather not use the term, since I'm sure he uses it to define anybody who's in fundamental disagreement with him.
Well, would you say that Tokyo Rose during World War II was anti-American?
I think one could... I think she's probably a paid propagandist would be a better way of describing it.
CIA paid.
I think that if one wants to reduce it to a very simple category of somebody who is not interested in working within American society, does not care about improving the lot of Americans, is not concerned about the best interest of Americans, is not concerned with American history as such, and is systematically anti all that, is interested in destroying the best interest and working against the best interest of America as he even conceives them, and for the interest of a foreign power, say the Japanese in the case of Tokyo Rose, I think you could safely call that anti-American.
Well, would you say that a person who by himself, let us say, had disagreed with the policy of government in World War II could be distinguished between someone who actively assisted Germany and Japan, let us say, in winning World War II?
Well, see, I won't defend every act just because it isn't anti-American. As I say, I find the term confusing. It depends upon the motives of a person in their activity. If a person supported Germany because they thought Germany was the wave of the future and that German supremacy was to be ensured and so forth, you know, that clearly is an anti-American act in a very simplistic sense. On the other hand, many right-wingers in America supported Germany because they felt that the Jews in Washington were destroying the best interests of this country, that the communists had taken over, and that Germany represented the last hope for restoring sanity to America. I don't agree with that point of view, but I wouldn't like to dismiss such people with the very simple and pejorative term of anti-Americanism. I'd rather argue against their factual understanding of the situation and tell them just why they're wrong on the issues.
Would you say that the exposure by Ramparts magazine of assistance given by CIA to various people, magazines, institutions, student organizations throughout the world had aided the Soviet Union?
I don't know. I find the Soviet Union to be so stumbling and dumb in its policies that nothing aids it very much. It certainly couldn't be taken away. Excuse me, I'm answering the question. It couldn't be taken away. Ramparts handle it because, as we pointed out, the very terrible thing about what the CIA had done is that it had reversed positions in the Cold War, brought us to the position of the Soviet Union, where in fact we were doing the same thing with our trade unions, our magazines, our universities as the Soviets were. We were making them organs of the government. We were subverting free student movements, free trade union movements, free magazines to government purpose, and the people working in those magazines or universities were not conscious of where the funds were coming from or where the direction was coming from.
But why were they being subverted?
When we talked about the increase of totalitarian in America, we drew an analogy with precisely the same kind of practice in the Soviet Union. And let me just add one other thing on that. I find that Mr. Buckley would be very happy to be a Maoist, if not for the accident of birth in which he inherited a Maoist or a Stalinist. You see, he happened to inherit $11 million and be raised in a milieu in America in which he's on one side of the fence and rather extremely pursues that. On the other side of the fence, a Maoist or Stalinist would think that anyone who was not in agreement with him had bad...
May I interrupt? Don't get upset. This is his
Are you guilty of inheriting $11 million?
No, but I would say that his inability to understand why someone in the Congo or South Africa might prefer to be a Maoist as opposed to an extremist.
You know about all those 27 million millionaires who voted for Goldwater, you know?
Yes.
The reason I raised the...
Wait a minute.
Unfortunately...
Can you stop that cataract for 1 minute?
It's pretty difficult. We have very little...
Let me just say this, because I want to say something. You know, Bobby Kennedy said about Ramparts, doesn't it ever say anything nice about anybody? To which, of course, Mr. Scheer gave the answer, yes, but he needs to have substantial facts to go on, and he never seems to find those facts.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid that
Mr.
Scheer, we're running out of time. I'm very sorry. No, I get the last word. You just keep quiet, and you keep quiet, too. I'm going to have the last word, and I'm going to call the meeting at an end because we're out of time. Thank you, Mr. Scheer, and thank you, Mr. Buckley. Oh.
Mr. Chairman, it seems to me clear that Mr. Scheer doesn't really understand the consequences of his own positions, and under the circumstances, I think he ought to be forgiven. Here's a man who, when he ran for election, used as a campaign manager a communist whose magazine defends a lot of positions that are uniquely defended by communists. I don't think he understands the consequences of it.
Mr. Scheer.
Yes, I might add that I mentioned Mr. Buckley's 11 million because I find it presumptuous that he could so accurately perceive the needs of people in undeveloped countries who live on $50 a day. I also find him to be highly anti-American in that his contempt for freedom, his support of the McCarthy Committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and his own red baiting and his own attacks on anyone who dissents in this society, and in fact his efforts to make a person who is a communist to become a non-person in much the same way as the Soviet Union has done.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is only too clear that this show could go on and on and on. Nevertheless, as we are out of time, the show must be closed. Thank you, Mr. Scheer. Thank you, Mr. Buckley.